Hey, this is John Reed, Diginomica, the last day of Sapphire 2025. I've got a very special guest. I'm so excited. This is Conor Riordan. How are you doing?
Yeah, delighted to be here, John. Yeah, really good.
Yep, we have done the classic commandeer a couple of chairs and grab a quieter hallway, though there is a little construction noise, so hopefully that'll be good on the taping for you. I've got my best sound setup possible. Conor is the chair of the Ireland and UKISUG group, or UKISUG as they say.
Exactly.
But we're putting Ireland first
We're putting
today.
Ireland first this week.
Yes, we are.
Yes.
You and I have had past discussions, and this is a really great opportunity to get your perspective and your customer perspective on, because in addition to the chair, you're also an SAP customer, and you have an interesting journey as well, because you've moved from technical leadership to business leadership. So that's a fascinating evolution for you.
Yeah, exactly. So, I started my SAP career back in Y2K. So I did a Y2K implementation of moving from an AS400 to an SAP system back in 99. And I was in a business role at the time. I was a business lead. And when we finished that project, I just stayed within the SAP arena for probably the next 20 odd years, doing multiple deployments across 3 different multinational organizations. And then about 5 years ago, I moved out of the IT organization back into global supply chain. And now I'm heading up customer service for EMEA for Pfizer, which is quite an interesting transition.
Yeah, and I really want to get back to that. What is your perception of like SAP's value proposition to customers and how it's evolved? Because obviously we've gone everywhere from kind of R3 client server days to S4HANA. Now you don't really hear S4HANA mentioned anymore. There's this. How do you see it from a customer's perspective in terms of SAP's evolution over all these years?
Yeah, so when we recently polled our community, there still is a large proportion of our user base that are still on ECC and are still managing the migration to S4. Obviously, we got the deadline at the end of 27. So there's still a large focus when we run our user group events in the UK. One of our best supported events will be, ECC to S4 projects. Mm-hmm. So that's still consuming a huge amount of our time. And probably to the detriment maybe of some of the newer technologies that SAP are coming out, because customers are still focused on, how do I get to the starting point? So how do I get onto an S4 platform? And then the question is, okay, well, if I'm going to do ECC to S4 migration, do I do a simple technical migration, or do I go, full Fury, Rise, the whole shooting match? And depending on the size of the organization, often maybe smaller organizations that are kind of going for the larger scope. But certainly what we're finding is the larger organizations, given the technical complexity of these migrations, are kind of doing a multi-step approach. So they're going ECC on-prem to S4 on-prem, technical migration, often going live with the GUI rather than Fiori. And so from an end user perspective, in that case, the user, logs out one weekend on ECC and logs in the following week on S4, and to them, nothing actually looks any different. So, I think part of the challenge here is that, these migrations are expensive, and the value is achieved in the S4 on doing the innovation. Mm-hmm. And it's how do you set up a program, this kind of multi-step program that you've got, and then state in terms of what you want, knowing that the biggest cost is probably going to be your ECC to S4, which is going to probably deliver no tangible business value, but you need that S4 footprint in order to start the innovation phase. Mm. So it's quite tricky. I think a lot of our customers are struggling with maybe the business case around how do you sell the multi-stage endpoint solution when maybe you're only going to get the money for the first phase of the program. Right. So that's kind of where we see it at the moment, certainly for the large companies.
So it sounds like the good news for SAP in that is that customers are largely like bought into, if I could snap my fingers overnight and run the latest and greatest SAP software, they don't have an issue with SAP's future direction and vision. It's more, how do I get there? Yeah, that poses the challenge for SAP and therefore for your customers.
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of the migration, I don't think there's a huge resistance. Most organizations need to move to S4. because they want to avail of the latest innovations, and therefore they know that they have to be on that platform. You will have certain organizations that ECC is working fine for them. You know, it's you know, and the innovations maybe are not needed. So you have a lot of maybe manufacturing organizations where the system is doing what they want to do. And so part of their challenge is, well, how do you justify the migration when your as-is solution is, you know, at the end of the day, ECC is a best-of-breed software.
Right.
You know, it is really, really good. And it does what it says on the tin. Like, so, you know, obviously during the migration, you have to, you know, you're going to have to do it at some stage, say in support, but it's building up that innovation business case.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point too, because part of what I think SAP might want to do there is to try to make the case that, yeah, your system is still working really well on ECC, but the world is changing pretty fast right now, and supply chains are more volatile, and it would be beneficial to be on a more agile platform where you could do a lot more, you know, scenario planning and assess different suppliers in real time and manage disruptions in real time. That'd be an interesting case for SAP to make to some of the happier customers. And I don't know how well that would go, but I think if I were SAP, that's the case I would try to make.
I think so. Look, I think SAP are bringing out some really interesting technology. I think what we're looking at as a user group is get us the customers to tell the story of their successes. So you have a lot of companies experimenting with agentic AI at the moment, probably with BDC, with Joule, and it's like, yeah, who's moved the needle? Like, who has standing up saying, you know what, we did this and we transformed our business, versus we did this and we got, like, you know, lots of small incremental value. So it's, I think there's a lot of promise, but we're still maybe waiting on the proof.
Right. So,
and that's okay, because you'd expect it to come, but we're still waiting, you know.
So the carrot is nice, but what you want is a garden full of carrots you can go pick and consume today and say, this is a really good carrot. Yeah.
You know, one of the phrases I hear a lot when people talk about, you know, Joule and agentic AI and any AI is like, you know, you have to teach the model, like, you know.
Right.
And that sounds very simple. You have to teach them, like, that's not easy. Like, that's complex. You know, teaching the model to be as accurate as a human, you know, 99.9% plus, like, that's a lot of work and a lot of energy. So when you start looking into these use cases, it's like, technically, yeah, I mean, logically, that sounds like a brilliant use case. Now, can you teach the model to be as accurate as a human to do it? Because if you can't, and you try and roll this out into a business scenario, and it's like 90% accurate and your human is 99% accurate, and human's just going to say, you know, just going to dispose of it too. So there's that piece around, you know, it's, I think some of this AI stuff for a very simple binary is excellent, and it will do stuff way faster than people. But then when you get into more complex scenarios where it's multivariate, humans, from a decision-making perspective, humans are still out beating these models in terms of decision-making.
Right. And I could complicate the picture a little further by saying, you know, in my talks with SAP's AI leadership, part of what this whole push to standard and modern SAP architectures is about is better AI, right?
Yeah.
So it complicates the pictures for your customers, because it's not like they can't consume AI in their current state. They certainly can. If not, they can do it from other vendors, but they can also do some of it through SAP, a good chunk of it actually through BTP. But that's not the same as Joule is built into everything you do. And so there's a bit of a data advancement that's needed as part of that upgrade, right? So it's not just a software upgrade, it's a data architecture improvement.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is not going to be a technology problem.
Right.
This is going to be a data problem, and it's going to be a document context problem.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was talking to one of the SAP colleagues there today around Joule, just for one of my simple scenarios, saying, you know, if I've got, say, I got to do a customer return, and I have 10 versions of my return policy that have changed over the last 2 years, and I sold this product 18 months ago, you know, how does Joule know which version of the returns policy to go look for. And she said, well, you have to train the model. And I'm going, like, how, and how do I train the model? So all of a sudden you realize, okay, I need to have these files that I might have just stored in a SharePoint in the past. And now I have to apply some logic or some tags to them to give it a bit of context. And so that's work.
Right.
And you go, okay, well now if I got to do that,
right,
and I got to do that at scale, is that worth it? Or does my use case start falling apart because I have to do that work? And I think that's where it's going to get a little bit interesting. It's like, is how much effort and energy is going to be required to make these models work at scale and make them work accurately?
Yeah.
The tech is going to work. The program's going to work. It's the fundamental underlying data sets and documents that are driving this.
Right.
And I'm sure over time it's going to be cleverer, but in the short term, I think it's going to be interesting. That's why I think we're all waiting for somebody to stand up at one of our user group conferences saying, hey, you know what? Here's this use case we have and we knocked it out of the park.
Yeah.
And we're still waiting, and I'm sure it'll come, but it's going to take a bit of time, I think.
Yeah, and I talked with SAP a lot on the record this week for stuff I'll be writing about in terms of their advancements with knowledge graphs, for example, because some of that can be dealt with via a knowledge graph scenario that's a lot easier to update than an LLM, which then gets provided as context and stuff. And then SAP is also building a foundation model that will have some of that context, though it won't be customer specific. But some of that stuff is a work in progress, and some of it requires customers to kind of move through a lot of the hoops you're talking about. And like you're saying, what you really want to hear right now is a customer on stage saying, we did this, we've done that, it's awesome, go do it. Like that will light a real fire.
Absolutely. I think Christian had a slide there he put up, the keynote yesterday about 30% labor efficiency.
Right.
And that's an interesting number because a lot of execs and a lot of business leaders will latch onto that kind of say, okay, well, if we deploy this technology, we can get 30% labor efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't plug in the agents and you get that. Like there's a tremendous amount of work to get that number. And I say it has to be as accurate as a human in decision making. And so I think what I've seen recently, we were over in Waldorf there at a SUGAN meeting in April, and we were looking at some of the models with Philip was showing us, and what it had within the model was the agents essentially doing all the heavy lifting in terms of compiling the information, but then the decision making was to the user to say, pick option A, B, or C, and then you pick option B, and then it goes off and runs another agent and gets more information. So it very much became an integrated process of the agents doing maybe the rapid collection and interrogation of data, but the decision making still sitting with the human.
Right.
And I think that's where it's going to go, because otherwise, I think the complexity of trying to automate human cognitive behavior is just, I don't think we're nowhere near that.
Exactly. And that's actually the first article I'm going to write about the show, because I didn't feel that SAP got that nuance across that much in the first keynote, where they talked about this in the Monday keynote. The Tuesday keynote. I'm getting my days confused. The opening keynote. I didn't think they got that across all that well. It felt, because there was a lot of emphasis on reason and action, and kind of made it seem like this is more of an autonomous vision. And granted, it's hard to do this in a keynote because there's so many time constraints on the keynote. Yeah. But in the QA afterwards with press, the kinds of questions you raised were coming out from the press there. And SAP, Herzig and Mohammed and Christian were there, and they had really good, thoughtful answers to exactly what you're describing. Like, they have thought through this, and they've thought through the implications of, hey, we have to be careful about how autonomous we are. We have to design this carefully. So I want to get that information out there, because I didn't think that came across as much in the keynote, but that was my perception anyway. But
yeah, because obviously, in a normal day-to-day process, when a human's making a decision around something, they have another 20 or 30 variables in their head that they're aware of. It's going to be raining next Tuesday. There could be a public sector strike. Yeah. So is my delivery going to be on time next week? A human brain can process stuff that no agent will ever be able to take into consideration. So sometimes we have the ability for cognitive processing, versus these tools, which is very analytical and binary. Yeah. And so it's how do you combine the two?
Yeah.
And I think that's what's going to be the success. If you're starting down a process where you think you're going to eliminate humans from the process, I think your probability of success is going to be low. If you integrate the human into the process in terms of your design, I think you come up with a really efficient way of working. But you got to be really thoughtful how you do it. It's just not plug it in.
Totally agree with you. And I rain on a lot of people's parades by saying that these are not cognitive systems, but I think it's a really, really important point that the cognition is largely still coming from the human and how they use these tools. But you can also make some smart design choices. So for example, like I just talked with Walter Sun before you, who's SAP's AI chief. And by the way, for listeners, SUGIN is International Consortium of User Groups, in case you're wondering about that SUGIN reference. But I was just talking to Walter's son about this, and the Perplexity partnership they announced. Part of the impetus behind that is thinking through this notion at the point of inference in this AI systems, when the AI is making a decision, does it have all the information variables that it needs, right? And yes, it needs your customer-specific information to make good decisions. But it might also need, for example, inflation data, up-to-date inflation data, or weather data is one of the obvious ones, right?
Yeah.
But I think you make a really good point, which is even if you architect that really well and incorporate a lot of the data sources of the AI might need in that moment, the human still may know some things that the AI doesn't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's not easily solved.
Mary's on holidays next week because you were talking to her at the weekend. And so, there's just this wealth of cognitive information that humans have that we can retrieve in like nanoseconds,
right?
In terms of our decision making. And so again, I think it comes down to the complexity of the problem you're trying to solve. I think for simple, very logical binary, I mean, you can certainly automate that. I think where it starts getting a bit more complex, you just need to basically have the human decision making built into the process. And I think much higher probability of success. But I think in general, though, the technology that's coming out is super cool.
Yeah.
And there's a huge potential. Unlike maybe, I talked to you earlier about the blockchain, blockchain 10 years ago, was loads of practical use cases, but in the end, none of them materialized.
This feels different.
I think this feels different. It still has the hype cycle. Yeah. We're still going to probably get into the trough of disillusionment over the next 12 or 18 months. But I think the probability of outcomes out of this is much higher. It's just I think the key thing for me is just being realistic. And certainly, when I come from my role now within the business community is, business leaders, they hear this, they get this information coming up from the partners, 30%, 40% efficiency. And they kind of then push that back into the organization saying, we have to do AI, we have to get ahead of the curve, and we need to hit these kind of synergy targets. And maybe sometimes, that understanding of how complex this is going to be. And this is not a 6-month project. This is probably going to be a multi-year, 5, 6, 7-year program.
Yep.
To get to that endpoint. And you're still going to have a human in the middle of the process, probably. But you're just going to do it faster. You're going to get to your endpoint faster, but you're still going to need people in the middle of the process.
So there's a lot of vendors, obviously, that are making a case for AI, both upstart vendors and very established enterprise software vendors. SAP is making the case that it can really deliver good AI to customers based on its thoughtful, responsible approach, all the customer-specific data that it can access and put into these systems. Do you think SAP's made a good case? You've pointed out that it's a journey to get there, but do you think they've made a good case, and what do your members think about that?
I think they are. I mean, I think, we did a survey last year amongst the 3 regions, ASUG, DSAG, and ourselves, UKISUG, in terms of the barriers here. There's still a lot of concern on the European side in terms of data security and data privacy and how this is all going to work. And I know we still have a lot of customers who haven't been able to start their AI journey because they haven't got legal sign-off. You get your contracts in, it's going through your legal review, there's issues, there's concerns. So there's still a barrier there on the legal side. But I think, I do think about the business level and the IT level, people are bought into the fact that this is the direction of travel. And that we have to work together to get there. And I think that's probably going to be one of the powers of the user group in terms of how do we collaborate as businesses? How do we come together as businesses? How do we tell our stories, success and failures, and help each other to try and, in partnership with SAP, because I think, they're learning as we're learning.
Yep.
And how can we have that feedback loop back into that organization so that, we're maximizing the outcome, the success outcomes of the program.
So you've been here for the full conference. What are you going to take back to your members from what you've learned this week? Any surprises, any things you really want to get across to them from what you've heard?
No, I think there's a few things. I think one of the things I didn't hear probably was rise and grow,
Right.
which is quite interesting. But I think,
And some of the changes SAP is making around
we
that.
did have a rebrand early on in the year, which was shared back probably in the UK back in February, part of the partner program in terms of rise being existing customers, move to the cloud, and grow being net new customers.
Right.
It was interesting, I think Thomas put up a slide this morning, he was saying 40% of, global revenue is now going through a RISE contract. I think it's an interesting number. It's again, sometimes when we talk to our customers, it's like, what's a RISE contract? Often customers have multiple systems and some of them could be on RISE contracts and others might be RISE contracts. So again, I think there's still a lot of, there's still a lot of curiosity and amongst our customer base in terms of the stories around the RISE program and customers' experiences. So that's certainly something I think is still going to be a focus point. I think our conference in November is going to be all focused on AI. This is our theme this year. So again, I think there's a huge appetite to learn. So it's going to be AI and business data cloud, Joule, and then on top of that, I think the last thing is probably, the public cloud, and where SAP is going with public cloud. And, again, we didn't hear business by design didn't come up, E1, like we have all these other components that,
right.
Again, it's probably still trying to understand is like what's SAP strategies in some of these other smaller platforms. But there's certainly a push from SAP to drive customers to public cloud, certainly net new customers.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of our members who maybe are on the ECC to S4 journey are still trying to consider, okay, do we go ECC to public cloud? Do we take that bold step? And if we do, what are the advantages to us as an organization? But I think the key thing is definitely going to be around the, I think Christian called it suite as a service rather than software as a service. So that integration of the applications with the AI, with the data and what that's going to look like. I think the Joule, the omnipresent AI copilot will be interesting. I think seeing Joule working on top of ServiceNow, conceptually is quite interesting. I think often getting these tools working is challenging.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting concept, but again, it's like, I don't think the challenge is going to be in the technology. I think the challenge is going to be in the data again, and the context. So how are these things going to work?
The irony is at the ServiceNow show, they basically show the reverse demo.
Probably,
of ServiceNow.
Yeah.
It's an interesting new phase in vendor fisticuffs, and which is interesting for customers because I think customers would prefer these vendors just get along and talk to each other. But
I think so. And I think, actually I did when I was over at Waldorf in April, and I was talking to Philip Herzig about this, I think one of the key challenges the industry faces is just harmonizing standards. So at the moment it's a bit of a Wild West, but everyone's building their own stuff with their own standards, and there needs to be, and I think SAP are definitely taking a lead in this in terms of how do you make these agents interoperable and how can you work across platforms? Because ultimately, as in customers, as users of these systems, like, as a business leader, I don't care which one I use.
Right.
I just want to use one and I want it to work. So I think there's, there is an onus on these customers or these software vendors to collaborate as much as they can from a standards perspective.
It is, I think the early signs there are encouraging with SAP's founding joining member of the Google's A2A agentic standard along with Microsoft sign on to that standards. There's some early good signs, I think, but like you said, there's a long way to go there. SAP is also doing a fair amount with MCP, which is a sort of agent protocol to dial the Anthropic developed to call upon various kinds of tools and stuff. So it's good to see some early involvement there, but it's early days in terms of that. But I think you're totally right. Like, there's going to have to be a lot of interoperability because we didn't hear a lot about that this week, but a lot of these things are going to stem beyond your SAP footprint, and you're going to need that to happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah, interesting.
I think the other thing for me, John, it's going to be quite interesting in the next 2 or 3 years, given my kind of being in both camps, being in the IT camp and being in the business camp now. And I would have some of my business leads be quite technical. I would like quite technical, especially graduates coming out of college. Like they're all tech savvy. So when you look at the low code, no code concept, you look at, today I was talking to folks on the Joule and they were talking about, business users, building their own AI agents. And I can see that from a business viewpoint going, this is brilliant. And then I can see it from an IT viewpoint being, this is a nightmare. Like, how do you control
the governance?
How do you govern this? How do you control it? How do you make sure people aren't like consuming all your credits of BTP?
It's like your business and IT personas are at war with each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things software vendors do is like they're software vendors. They're not change management people.
Yeah.
And so I think with this evolution from like on-prem, old school R3, ECC to these cloud softwares, there needs to be a figuring out of the new roles within the organization. So like, what's your traditional IT roles? What's your new business roles? And within this, because one of the things that I spoke to, an interesting, one of the interested team from Joule today was in order for these agents to work, you need to understand the business process end to end, be able to pull it together. And so business understand the business process. And often your IT colleagues will understand part of the business process. So they're specialists in an area. So if we're looking at order to cash, they might be specialists in the order side, but might necessarily be specialists in the distribution side or in the invoice side or in the credit and return side. So it's how do you, if success within some of these areas is understand the end-to-end process, how do you empower the end user in the low code, no code world?
Right.
And what's the role of IT to support them? And part of that might be, as a user, maybe I build in the development box an agent that's to 90%, and then I give it to the IT guy who writes, smart guy writes some code and polishes it off, tests it, and move it into production. But I think there's a new world there of figuring out the roles.
Yeah.
Because it's not the same as it was a couple of years ago, and especially as teams go to rise, like, SAP talk about the solution architects now being key roles within the organization, within IT, and they are, like, and again, solution architects tend to be end to end rather than siloed.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's anyone necessarily looking at it. Like, as tech companies, it's not their job. They're rolling out software. And again, I think it's one of the things we spoke about at the keynote last year. Like, and I think we have to relook at this year is, as user groups, do we have a role in terms of helping organizations figure out the change management around what does the new world of running an SAP system is, with all this new technology.
I do think it's good to challenge tech vendors, including SAP, on this point, though, because I think there can be a tendency to overemphasize the business user empowerment narrative of like, soon your business users will be building domain-specific agents or whatever. And the idea that you could get 90% there is still a powerful concept, but you do need to close the loop with IT because they're going to need to be there. I don't care if it's close to 99%. There's still got to be some validation of securities and roles and securities and ongoing testing and all of that. And without IT's buy-in to this, I don't see how it works. And so
and it
I think
work,
you need a different, I think a slightly more robust, nuanced, whatever you want to call it, way of presenting that to customers. It doesn't always have to be, oh, the business user can just run off and do this.
Yeah, and I think, John, we saw this a couple of years ago with RPA, when RPA came in first with Blue Prism and these kind of tools. And the business were off building RPAs, and everything's great till you get the month end and the RPAs fail, and all of a sudden they're raising tickets with the IT help desk. The IT guys go, but we didn't build any of this. So we don't know what you've built. So you do need so if you're building solutions within the business that are mission critical, and which they will become, you need a level of governance and you need a support model. And so you got to figure out how you empower the end user within a governance framework that's still managed and controlled by IT, because it is really important from the security, governance, all that stuff. You need it. And you need a resilient operation. But it needs to be figured out. And at the moment, it's too easy to throw it out there as
agreed.
Yeah, low code, no code, off you go, end users. And
to be clear, I think SAP I would put them in the higher echelon of vendors that I think understand these issues, because they've spent a lot of time with CIOs, but they don't always present it that way. And that's kind of what I'm challenging a little bit, because I think the perception of that is important too.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And these are all, I think, these tend to be all the soft things that slow down these projects and slow down the ability to realize the value. Again, it's rarely the tech.
Yep.
It's always the softer.
So I did want to mention just briefly for our listeners that I thought that your collaborative research with DSAG and ASUG on the AI adoption was really, really important. And I wrote about that research, and I encourage listeners to check out the ASUG Talks podcast with you and Jens and Jeff Scott talking through that research. I think it's really important that you did that. And I think you should, definitely revisit that at a later point, because that's just invaluable to customers to hear you guys hashing that out. I wanted to ask you briefly about the Business Data Cloud announcement, because SAP considered that one of their biggest news announcements in years, the spring Business Data Cloud. And we've talked a lot about AI and the relationship to data. How do you and your members view this? Is this a welcome development? Because I know that it raises a lot of questions in terms of prior investments in other, SAP products, whether it's BW or even DataSphere from a licensing perspective. But how do you view the evolution of SAP's data narrative?
I think it's definitely a welcome development. I mean, it's always been a bone of contention that, within all the products, like you only have SAP data for SAP Analytics with BW, etc. So to be able to have SAP and non-SAP data on a structured platform certainly is valued. I think the challenge for a lot of our members is going to be, as you say, over the years, because SAP couldn't do the two, most organizations have built very sophisticated data warehouses, data lakes with, multiple software platforms with multiple analytical platforms on top of it. And so you're going to have a significant investment there. And now you're bringing in Data Cloud. And it's like, okay, what is that additive to the existing landscape? Or are you retiring some of the list? So are you spending more money or less money? And how do you protect your existing investment, but at the same time get the value from the new technology? So I think I think it's quite new, and people are still trying to figure it out. I think we had the executive network there on Monday, and some of the customers that had recently put in DataSphere, for example, they're now going, okay, so I've done DataSphere, what do I do? How do I go from DataSphere to Data Cloud? And in all fairness, they kind of said, look, there's a pathway coming up later in the year in terms of how you can migrate your models over and stuff. But I think it's early days. I think there's still a lot of thinking going on here. And I think, again, maybe on the softer side, there's a lot of IT organizations that have got their careers built on the existing legacy data warehouses and all these systems. So there's going to be a massive change management piece there as well, in terms of how do you convince the owners of the as is today that maybe might be in the SAP sphere to adopt this SAP technology and migrate away from their current. So, but I think long term, the strategy of having your business data cloud with your AI agents underneath and your Joule, it makes logical sense. I think it's where companies will have to get there.
So a couple more topics. I wanted to talk with you about SAP's public cloud software value proposition. For the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to avoid the rise and grow terminology because those have been reconfigured. And I'm going to talk about private edition, which is more the larger landscapes that just move into a private cloud and then go into a clean core scenario over time, versus a public cloud, which is a very different scenario. And it's hasn't been used as much for like the larger footprint, but I did talk with a customer today that chose to move their manufacturing operations to the public cloud, and they actually did it a number of years ago. And when I talk with public cloud customers, the stories are just impressive to me. They have an energy and an excitement that I don't frankly get as often from the private cloud stories. I do occasionally,
Yeah.
but the public cloud stories are just compelling to me in terms of things like they talk about the ease of upgrade and absorbing new functionality. They talked about this manufacturer talked about like, okay, yeah, we did have to do some custom stuff, but we did it via the extensible framework. And guess what? We've upgraded a bunch of times and none of it is broken. And we're just much more agile as a business now. We have better inventory visibility and our employees love the software and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just sitting here, I'm saying, God, I want to hear more of these kinds of SAP stories. And he's sitting there saying to me, more customers need to look at this now and quit being so afraid of this option. And this is a customer that went years ago as a manufacturer, not a stereotypical like public cloud customer that was in the services industry. This is a hardcore manufacturer. They're not huge, but they're sizable. So my question to you would be like, am I off base here because maybe in Europe, it's a little more sophisticated in some ways with regulations or something? Or like, do you also see this option as a little more interesting? Because I just hear a lot of passion behind the public cloud customers that actually take the plunge.
Yeah, look, I think it's a really interesting space. So one of the things we've decided to do this year is so we've got, I think, 17 communities within our user group. This year, we're launching a public cloud community, just specifically to focus on public cloud so that we can get those public cloud customers together to talk about, as you're saying, the success stories and the lessons learned, but also use it as
that's
a
a real
platform.
carrot. That's not a hypothetical carrot. That's like a real carrot.
And I suppose we're trying to do it from two reasons. One is it's also a growth area for us because these public cloud customers traditionally wouldn't be the members of the user group.
Right.
Because often they're net new, they're coming in, they're buying the public cloud, and maybe they don't see a need for the user group in the short term because all the user group are talking about is S4 migrations and all this complexity and whatever. But as I say, we have some of our existing ECC on-prem members that would say, instead of migrating to S4 on-prem, why don't I go to public cloud?
Right.
So I think I've heard of a good few use cases of our existing customer base that are doing those assessments at the moment.
Right.
I think sometimes it's difficult if you're running on ECC for 20 years or 25 years.
Sure. You've
built up a load of enhancements. This is the way you work. And you look at public cloud, you're going, it's so different from what we do today. Like, can we change the business? And sometimes maybe it needs kind of fresh leadership, to kind of relook at it. Sometimes it's like, does the company have the appetite to do it? So I think there's a lot of softer factors in there. But I think it's something over the next couple of years. I think it's going to be. I think for SAP, like there's just such a push to try and get customers on there too. It does make their life easier from a management perspective. It also makes our customers' life easier, as you say, to go on that. So,
and they're also SAP is also saying, and Philip Herzig has said this to me several times, is that deploying AI functionality at scale for customers is just a lot easier on standardized public cloud software. And so, that's good for SAP, but SAP is saying that's also good for you as a customer.
Well, I think it was last year, actually, we were over in Waldorf in one of our Sugan meetings, and Jan Gillick was just, it was kind of the great thing about Sugan is you sit with an hour for these guys and you just have these open conversations. And I think Jan was explaining to us, like, today, like you've got an ECC system that they have to support. They have something like 7 or 8 versions of S4 they got to support. So every time they bring out some new piece of functionality, they kind of have to make it backward compatible, like with 7 or 8 different versions of software, and they got to support that. And like, there's a massive cost associated with developing and making it backward compatible. And not only is that a cost that's you'd say, well, is that value add? But it also slows down innovation because the resources are, so everything slows down. So, from their perspective, getting everybody onto the same install base means they can drive innovation faster, deliver innovation faster, and manage it easier. So I think long term, 10 years, maybe 15 years, I think ultimately everyone will be going to public cloud at some point in time. But it's definitely the direction of travel. And I can see from an SAP perspective, and it's easy when they kind of share the numbers that I won't share, but the amount of money they're spending on older versions is staggering. So for us as customers, even though there's pain, it also makes sense because our license money is going into paying for better innovation rather than maybe reinvesting in older versions of software. So
there's some really interesting tensions there, right? Because there's customers that have invested a lot in the platform over the years, but they don't want to move for whatever reason, and they like it the way it is. Like you said, their ECC is fine. Then SAP is pushing a clean core mantra, and sometimes it's hard to attach business justification to that. But then in the long term, you look at the value of having more standardized processes and saving customization for when you really need it, as opposed to just paying SIs a ton of money for customizations that quickly become, technical debt. It's a very tricky argument, right? Because you can make supporting cases on both sides.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's sometimes even within organizations, you see some of our processes, we maybe could see them as competitive advantage. I mean, we've built functionality within our SAP system. We say that's competitive advantage. So it's not just functionality. It's actually, it's helps us get to market faster or to deliver better products. So sometimes it's not just we build something and we could have done it on BTP or, whatever. Right. It's like, this is competitive advantage. And so I think definitely when you get into the larger organizations, it's a more challenging discussion. But you do then see, you see some big companies now, making a move. Obviously, first step is probably going to Rise and then clean core programs. So it is happening. It's just the speed and all these things. The speed is just not going to be, it's not going to be light speed. It's not going to be 2 or 3 years. There's going to be a long tail in this.
And I think, and I think if I'm taking the customer hat and I'm on an older release, at the least I'm expecting SAP to have a lot of dialogue with me. So in other words, it's pretty aggressive to say, here's your end of maintenance deadline. Obviously there's some caveats there in terms of extended support, but that's an aggressive move, right? When I experience end of maintenance in my consumer software, I get annoyed. When certain releases get sunsetted. And so that's aggressive. But I'm also wanting to hear about all of that in the sense of if SAP then comes to me and says, we hear you, but here's some of the reasons why we feel we have to do this. Here's some of the pathways we've created to make this easier for you. And what you started hearing about this week was more emphasis on migration tools, more emphasis on, we're going to help you with the process analysis of all of this through Signavio or whatever. I think if I'm a customer, if you're going to take an aggressive strategy, I also want to have a really thoughtful dialogue with you around how you're going to make this easier for me.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, I think when you are where we are today in 25 and 27 is very close, it may sound like an aggressive strategy. At the other hand, S4 was launched in 2014. It's 13-year-old software. It's obviously gone through multiple releases. And I think, there comes a point where, you got to let go of ECC too, and it is difficult. If you're running an organization where ECC is like a big diesel engine and it's just working, and there's no value proposition, there's no business case to move, that's a tough spot to be in, because the only reason you're moving is to be on a supported application. And if that is going to cost you a couple of $1 million, that's a hard position to be in. But, it's the law of diminishing returns, with SAP, how long do you keep the tail on this ECC? And it's now 12, 13 years. So
So this is why I think the public cloud customers are so important, because I think the happy public cloud customers can step into that dialogue and say, look, we're a lot more agile as a business because of the moves we made. And they can say that to their peers, and the peers can look at them and say, wow, you can do some things that I can't. You can absorb acquisitions much faster than I can, for example. You can roll out subsidiaries much faster than I can. I think that's a bit of a wake-up call, perhaps, to customers that are in a comfort zone, and to your point, in a year or two from now, we may hear more of that from the AI side as well. It's just that we're not quite there yet, but in a year or two, you might also hear that from an AI side and say, look, we're able to do some things with AI that frankly, we couldn't do before.
I mean, I would certainly say that we're going to see more agility in the public cloud, and even things like the sustainability solutions that SAP have built, like they're only available for Rise public cloud customers. Like, so even at that, like there's innovations being delivered that are not available unless you're on these platforms. And I think a lot of the innovation being built will be built public first, private second. So it's, I mean, you can see the way this is going, like, ultimately getting, from an SP perspective, getting to the public cloud means you're going to get, better solutions, better access, quicker innovation. What do you have to give up? You're going to have to give up some, local enhancements and maybe local business processes that you've had for 20 years that you have to re-engineer, but that's, that might be short-term pain, like, that you can work around. So.
Absolutely. It's not a simple narrative, right? Because you can't construct an easy narrative on this, like, well, SAP's really turning its back on customers by doing these, kind of forced upgrade timelines. No, it's not that simple. But then it's also like, you can't just say to customers like, you don't need to modernize because, like you said, like maybe it's time to take a hard look at what you're doing. And, I think it's just interesting because I think that's why I think these open, honest conversations are so valuable, because there is no one like easy narrative to all of this. It's more about, I think, what SAP at its best does is say, let's talk with our user groups, let's talk with customers about the problems we're facing collectively, like in our companies, in our industry. SAP is going through the same transformations internally, and they've talked with some of us about that this week in terms of their own adoption of things like Business Data Cloud, why they needed to do it. Let's have a collective conversation about like the world that we're living in now and how to contend with it, And I think if SAP does that, I think a lot of customers are going to come along, but we'll see.
Yeah. And so I say, I think as a community, there's a lot of excitement. And there's also probably a lot of maybe, I won't say doubt and skepticism, but we want to see the success stories, and they will come. And I think for us, say this year, our conference in November, I was talking to Craig this morning saying, our job in the next 3 months is to find customers with success stories around AI, BDC, Duo, and get them on stage to show what's possible to the user community. And then get our public cloud community set up this year, so we can also share the messages around public cloud with our older ECC customers that might be, apprehensive, not sure. They can turn up to our community meetings and listen and go, okay, this company is similar to mine. They seem to be running in public cloud. Well, why can't I do it?
Right.
So sometimes you just got to hear the stories rather than from a sales guy. You hear the story from a customer.
And by the way, one of my goals for the year is to take that type of discussion and sharpen it just a little bit to figure out if there are legitimate barriers, to the public cloud adoption. Let's figure out what those are and make sure SAP has those on the roadmap. So for example, if there is a key piece of functionality that is very difficult to build as an extension that needs to be shipped with the public cloud, let's solve that, right? Let's solve the real barriers so that the barriers of fear can be dealt with and solve the real ones. I think that would be the step forward as far as I see it. Okay, final question, which kind of draws on your own transition from IT to business. One dynamic that I'm picking up on with my colleague, analyst Josh Greenbaum, we've been at a couple of ASUG and user group shows last year. at the annual conference here, doing workshops with customers, and also at ASUG Tech Connect, which, by the way, would be great if you could come sometime to that fall show. We talk with users there, and a lot of IT leaders, basically, and also enterprise architects who are senior tech people, not necessarily CIO level, but they're senior tech. They're all coming back with a struggle of, how do I talk to the business and get more buy-in from the business? Sometimes it's a formal business case. Sometimes it's just being able to say, this is why the clean core stuff that we're doing is going to have business relevance to you, a business user, even though it seems like a technical thing we're fussing over. You've kind of lived both those things. What is your advice to senior tech folks inside the SAP community to learn how to sort of engage more effectively with business users in the terms that they understand?
Yeah. So I think what I found when I made the transition over is the business is less hung up about the technology and more focused on the outcome. So it's all about, what business outcomes are we looking for? What problems are we trying to solve? What's the business process to solve that problem? And then what's the data, what's the data that's required to feed that business process? And then when you kind of get to that level, then the kind of conversation said, okay, so what are the technology options? So the conversation has to be led by the outcomes and the process rather than the technology. And so when I worked in SAP on the IT side, it was like, you go in with like, why not SAP? We're an SAP shop, so why not SAP? And invariably we finished up with an SAP solution anyway. But at a business level, it's people don't worry. They'll take any solution. They don't care about the architecture. They don't care about how it works. It's more about, okay, what problem are we trying to solve? What business outcomes are we looking for? What's the business process we want to configure? What's the data we need to drive this? And then you get to the technology. The tricky thing, and I've been kind of fortunate in terms of my career working in IT, because I was very much working on the rolling on SAP. So very much on deployments. So I'd have had a very broad
You had early exposure to process thinking and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I've worked in manufacturing, I've worked in finance, I've worked in sales, I've worked in warehousing, I've worked in distribution, I've worked in treasury. So I've worked across all these business process areas. So for me, when I think business process, it's kind of all, it's all natural to me because I worked it. But sometimes it's quite daunting for IT colleagues that have deep technical knowledge in an area. So again, like in my space now, which is order to cash, I'd have IT teams that are focused on the sales process.
Right.
IT teams are focused on the delivery and warehousing process. IT teams on the invoicing process, more on the accounts receivable process. So you got 4 separate teams that have got real deep technical knowledge in their space, but horizontally don't necessarily understand how they're connected. And I think that's where the role that I hear now with SAP around the solution architect is becoming more and more important. So as we move away more from building to buying, maybe to extensibility, it's to have IT colleagues that are more focused on the horizontal and the architecture than on the vertical, on the technology stack and how do we configure and optimize a specific area of the business. And I think that's the direction of travel. I think it's for IT colleagues as we go through these RISE programs and as we handing over technology to SAP to manage for us, that's where it's going to be. I think it's going to be on data architecture, on solution architecture. I think the other thing IT colleagues have a really strong handle on is around data architecture. They understand that fundamentally way better than we do from a business perspective. So I think there's a real value add there. And they're very process oriented as well. So I think that that's what I would say to them is kind of get out of the weeds of the vertical and try and get to the horizontal, and really focus on business outcomes. And I think that's, again, even when you think about the AI stuff here, is like there tends to be at the moment a leading with, here's the technology and here's the solution, rather than, okay, well, what's the problem, what's the outcome?
Right.
Some of them will work, but I think it's working backwards again, and that's where the AI is going to be successful or not. It's like, what's the problem we're trying to solve? what's the process, what's the data we need. And then when we got all that figured out, okay, let's build the agent rather than start with the agent and work forward.
Yeah.
But I do think there is a transition going to happen. It has to happen within the IT SAP space that just needs to be figured out from a change management viewpoint. What are the new roles? How do you transition people from the old roles to the new roles? And it needs to be something that's actively managed rather than just IT leaders thinking people are going to figure it out themselves, because the landscape has totally changed.
Well, we could do a whole podcast on that single topic, but I think we're going to leave it there. Conor, thank you for joining me on this time-honored tradition of the Sapphire Wrap podcast. I couldn't imagine a better guest. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jeff.
Appreciate it.